stay tuned because for the next 60 minutes, Motorsports Unlimited is on the air. Hi, I'm Jerry Bryant, and these are the lovely ladies of motorsports. And all this hour, we're going to have 60 minutes of action-packed excitement. All kinds of exciting things will happen. And we got the famous Bill Wildt, and we got all kinds of other good stuff that's happening all this hour. Motorsports Unlimited, 60 minutes of non-stop action. So let's go to the studio right now.
Thanks, Jerry. And hi, everybody. Welcome to the studio headquarters of Chicagoland's most watched, most talked about Access television series. I'm Bill Wildt, and this is the 1415th edition of Motorsports Unlimited. Today, as promised, we begin our discussion of 501c3. I know. It sounds boring, and it is. But as I said before, it's important and is one of the things that is contributing to the loss of motorsports in our culture. Yes, you're right. I've said over and over, the loss of motorsport is because of our omission from network television sports news, and that's true. But it's not the only thing that is killing us. I wish it were as simple as one single thing that needs to be fixed in order for us to survive, but like most things in life, it's complicated. And once you understand a little about 501c3, you'll see it too has contributed greatly to our demise. When I looked into it 30 years ago, I realized it was a cesspool and left a bad taste in my mouth. It was something I didn't want to be any part of. I'm going to explain all of it as we get into it. First, I want to start with a question. Do you know what 501c3 is? I know I ended a sentence with a preposition. I'm a racer, not a writer. Again, the question is, do you know what 501c3 is? I didn't think so. And yet, it's very important and plays a role in all of our lives. While you think about it, I want to take a moment to talk about something else. As we record this piece of the program I'm titling Explanation 9, it is Wednesday, November 29th, 2017. A few days ago, it was Thanksgiving, November 23rd, 2017. On that date, we lost one of auto racing's greats, and I wanted to make a note of it. Gene Marmer passed away peacefully after a lengthy illness. Gene was a big late model star at O'Hare Stadium. At least that's where I saw him race. I was just a kid racing in the lower cadet division, but I knew who the big guys were. Bill Lutz, Eric Johnson, Freddie Lorenzen, Whitey Gherkin, Gene Marmer, and others too numerous to mention, and I know I'll forget someone if I try to name everyone. Anyway, Gene was indeed one of the big guys. He also raced at Rockford Speedway and Soldier Field. He even won a USAC race at Meadowdale Raceway driving a '57 Chevy. But his home stomping grounds, in my opinion, were O'Hare Stadium and Rockford Speedway, where he won multiple track championships at both facilities. I remember him most at O'Hare Stadium in his 1963 Chevy convertible. That's right, they ran convertibles back then, and you could actually see the drivers work. Gene was a guy who intimidated the competition. He was a tough driver and a tough guy. There were plenty of stories of on-track and off-track fights. Gene didn't just participate in that environment, he prevailed. There was never any question about his talent. He was inducted into the Illinois Stock Car Hall of Fame in 2012. I would urge people to check out Stan Kalwasinski's website, chicagolandautoracing.com. He wrote a beautiful piece titled Gene Marmer, in which the first line read, Gene Marmer, one of the best in Chicago area stock car racing. His record speaks for itself. I couldn't begin to tell the Gene Marmer story as well as Stan does. Please read it. I'll give the website address again in a few minutes. I had the honor of interviewing Gene Marmer when he was about 64 years old. We were doing a story about the long-gone O'Hare Stadium that most people have forgotten. Gene was kind enough to participate and even brought a number of pictures taken at O'Hare Stadium. For those who don't remember, O'Hare Stadium was located on Manheim Road just south of Irving Park Road. Part of the Sloan Valve Company is located on a piece of the old O'Hare Stadium property, and they were good enough to give us permission to conduct the interview in one of their conference rooms that was located on O'Hare Stadium property. I think what I remember most about the interview was, despite all the tough guy stories, which he didn't deny, he was quite a gentleman and accommodating. I liked him. But I recall, like it was yesterday, that while I was interviewing him, I could still see the tough guy in his eyes, even at 64 years old. Gene was 87 years old when he passed away, and I checked all the network news programs to see if ABC, NBC, or CBS mentioned his passing. Of course, they didn't. Gene deserved better. As Stan Kawasinski wrote, his record speaks for itself. Oh yes, Stan's website address. It's chicagolandautoracing.com. The article is called Gene Marmer. If you didn't know Gene and his racing accomplishments, you should. Check it out. Let's talk about 501c3. It's part of the tax code. When I began contemplating the notion of telling the public what was happening with what I saw as the unfair use of the public airwaves and how our community was being omitted and the consequences of that omission, I knew it was going to cost money to get the word out. But I was determined to solve what I saw as a solvable problem. While it is true that public access cable television is a wonderful way to be heard, and the use of the video equipment to produce programming is indeed free, and they do teach you how to use the equipment for free, and they air whatever you produce for free, but that doesn't even begin to fund what it takes to create the content of your programming. I know it all sounds like mumbo jumbo, and to some extent it is. From the beginning of Motorsports Unlimited, I have always objected to being forced to accept the administrative language architecture of television production. Calling what we do programming makes it sound like we are just another television show, as in commercial television production, rather than the people's right to be heard or free speech. Over time, I suppose I sort of accepted the use of television terms like programming and time slots. There were a couple of reasons. First, it is practical language. When you take a tape to the cable company to air, they understand what you are doing and what they are supposed to do. Handing them a tape and saying, "There's the next part of my argument regarding the omission of motorsport from network television sports news," wouldn't communicate, "I want you to air the tape." I suppose I could have argued harder about the way we have to communicate with them, but it seemed to me that was an argument for another time, and I didn't want to waste my time telling them how much I resented filling out the forms in which I had to put my name down as a producer or being identified as the producer or director or host. The fact is, I'm not a producer or director. I'm a racer. My life is about building engines and chassis for vehicles to be used in competition. My work is about developing ideas to advance technology. I'm just a guy who recognized how badly the community of which I am a part has been damaged by those who get to unfairly use the public airwaves. I didn't want a new career. I wanted to fix the one I had. Learning television was just something I had to do to solve the problem I'd identified. I remember one time when we traveled to Wisconsin to shoot a program about the DeSalvo racing team's new race car, a drag racing T Roadster as I recall. After setting up the video equipment and the portable lighting, I ducked into a small office they had off to the side of the work area to change into my on-the-air clothes. I could sort of overhear bits and pieces of some of the conversations they were having while waiting for us to start taping. "No, he's okay. He's kind of like we are. He knows his stuff." I remember making a mental note of it. I thought to myself, what do you mean, kind of like you are? I am you. Just 2 days ago, I was welding a new rear frame loop on a flat track motorcycle racer's frame. I thought to myself, does being on television really set me aside from the guys? When I step out of this little makeshift dressing room wearing a tie and jacket and grabbing a microphone, am I still not the same person? It was an odd feeling. I wear a tie and jacket for my television work for the same reason I wear a welding helmet when I'm welding. It serves a purpose. I'll get to all that before this explanation series is over, but right now I found myself pondering how television had changed how I'm perceived. I've spent most of my life in motorsports and like to think I'm an effective competitor. Yet, these guys obviously thought of me as a television person. It was very strange indeed, but a reality I had to accept, like the reality of signing paperwork indicating I was a producer or a director or whatever. But I sure don't want that on my tombstone. I sure hope it says Bill Wildt, racer. I was just a guy who saw the community of which he was a part disappearing, and out of survival desperation finally decided to put down the tools, lock the shop, and see what I could do to save this community. In that process, I determined there were a couple of things that were killing us. First and foremost was our omission from network television sports news, but there was something else that didn't make sense, and I'm getting to it. Perhaps I should back up here for a moment. When I decided to do something about what I saw as the loss of motorsports, I looked at it like a competitor. When someone is involved in racing, he has to do a number of things to be competitive. First, he has to find out what the rules are. You know, the parameters of what one needs to be competitive. Take flat track motorcycle racing as an example. It doesn't make any difference if I use late model dirt car racing or NASCAR stock car racing as an example. The theory is all pretty much the same and isn't really complicated. For flat track racing, one needs a rule book that clearly explains what you are allowed to do and in order to be in the competitive arena. This can mean anything from how big of an engine one can use to how your pit crew must be dressed. Continuing with the flat track example, if you want to race at Santa Fe Speedway on Wednesday nights, the bike you build cannot have an engine larger than 250 cc's, two-stroke or four-stroke. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the woods regarding technical specification because it gets quite involved, and that's not what this is about. Not to mention, I'm using rules from the early 70s because I lived with them for so long. But every organization is similar, and time doesn't change the point I'm making. The rules might include everything from allowable wheelbase to allowable tire selection, allowable fuel, etc., etc. It's all designed to make sure you are competing on a level playing field, and we're all racing apples against apples and oranges against oranges. To ensure the fairness of competition in flat track racing, the organization always has a tech inspector. When you sign up to race, the tech inspector will, in all likelihood, check out your bike to make sure it is within specifications. Of course, using Santa Fe Speedway as an example, with an average of 150 racers signing up to race every Wednesday night, the tech inspection is pretty loose. They sort of depend on the competitors pointing out something they don't think is legal so the tech inspector can take a closer look. Then there is usually a second safeguard, protest. If a racer feels someone has an unfair and/or illegal advantage, they can put up a small amount of cash and file a formal protest. Usually this means the tech inspector will demand the offending competitor to tear down his engine and prove it is legal. If the protest is upheld, the offending competitor is eliminated from competition. If the person's protested turns out to be legal, he gets to keep the protest money. Sometimes, and I'm reaching way back in my memory to the early 70s, the organization may have a claiming rule. Its purpose is to keep the cost of equipment down as well as maintaining a level playing field. The claiming rules vary from organization to organization, but in general they establish a price for the piece of equipment you are racing, let's say $5,000. If a competitor in the same race thinks he is being outspent on machinery, he can provide the organization $5,000 and claim the winner's machine. In any event, we can argue about the fairness of the various rules and rule enforcements and what works and what doesn't work, but the idea is to make sure everyone has a fair chance to compete. So, for the purposes of this discussion, competing has at least two parts. First, make sure you build within the rules the most competitive machine possible. Second, make sure the other competitors also follow the rules so everyone has a fair chance to compete. You know, I hope this makes sense. To have honest competition, there must be a level playing field. Without a level playing field, there is no point in competing. In fact, competing would be impossible. As aggravating as they can be, there is a reason for rules and regulations, and a level playing field should be the result. This notion of competition and the need for fair play is an important concept in a nation that is built on competition and fair play. In fact, our system can't work without fair play. I remember many decades ago when I was in my early 20s. This was long before I started contemplating the imminent loss of the motorsport community and had nothing to do with motorsport. It was just a moment in my young life that left an impression. There was a bar on the north side of Chicago that I frequented enough to get to know the owner/bartender. I began to notice that about once a month, the place was dead. After noticing the repeated dead night, I asked the bartender/owner if he could explain it. The place was quiet, and he took a moment to sort of cry on my shoulder. kind of a reverse bartender deal. He intimated that the local church down the street held something called a Las Vegas night once a month, and it killed his business. I've heard of it, but I didn't realize it had any effect on business. He said it killed his. I asked him if he'd complained to anyone about it, really just making conversation. He said he couldn't because this was a Catholic neighborhood and he didn't want to be known as the bar that complained about the church's Vegas night. He figured his business was mostly Catholic. He continued grumbling about how unfair it was. The church doesn't have to pay taxes or buy a business license, etc. They shouldn't be taking my business away from me. I remember thinking about it. He was in a tough spot. He didn't want to alienate his regular clientele by going against the church, yet it wasn't right that they should be allowed to hurt his business. I think the discussion ended when he or I said, well, it's only once a month. As I said, it was only a moment in my life, but that's what life is about, moments. And over time, collective moments. I guess I sort of tucked it away in my mind as an unresolved issue. By the way, churches are 501c3 organizations. I didn't know that at the time, nor had I even heard of 501c3. I just knew churches didn't pay taxes. At that time, I was far more interested in riding my motorcycles, taking my boat out, and chasing girls. I suppose for this to make sense, I should make some mention of what it takes to open and run a small business. I mean, I've talked about what it takes to successfully compete in motorsport. I guess it's appropriate to make some mention of what it takes to compete in business. After all, at some level, as boring as business is, if motorsport is to survive as anything other than a novelty or toy of the wealthy, it must operate successfully as a business. As much as people, like me, see motorsport as something of a laboratory to competitively test technical ideas in a public competitive environment, the fact is, to survive, motorsport must generate more revenue than has to be expended to produce it. In America, something that costs more money to make than one can charge for it will soon be gone. We don't have, nor should we, government subsidies to support these activities. They have to pay for themselves and then some in order to survive. That's the way a capitalist system works. Perhaps 40 years ago, I stumbled upon some numbers that were alarming. It seems that in 1953, there were more than 2,500 racetracks in this country, and at the time I read those numbers, there were fewer than 800 tracks remaining. It didn't take a genius to figure out we were at risk. Now, I've mentioned all this before, many times. Of course, if I had a lick of sense, I would have found something else to do. I mean, after all, no one gets on a plane that's going to crash, and clearly all the signs of crash were there. But there was an occasional glimpse of possibility that kept me going. I remember attending something at the Arlington Heights horse racing track called the Yamaha Gold Cup. I don't remember the year, but it had to be in the early 70s or maybe late 60s. Anyway, I attended the event with my wife, my high school friend Todd, and his wife. It was a first-class operation. Oddly, we were unable to buy a program. We were told they printed 25,000 programs based on the projected crowd size. The programs were sold out more than an hour before the event started. I don't know how many people attended. The stands looked full. And I remember being encouraged. The Arlington Heights facility was first class and the motorcycle racing was stunning and looked great in that facility. I remember thinking, it is possible. We'd all hoped the event would become annual and frankly thought it was a foregone conclusion. There was no way they didn't make money. The crowd was huge, the show was great, and we had the feeling big time was just around the corner. Unfortunately, it was the only time the event was held. We heard all kinds of stories about the neighbors didn't like the noise, or Yamaha spent a fortune and didn't want to do it again, or didn't want to face lawsuits from Arlington Park neighbors. We don't know what happened, but it turned out to be a one-time event. Too bad. It was special. And one thing it did do was show me how good motorsport could look on a grand scale. If it was true that Yamaha spent a fortune on it, it was money well spent. The Yamaha Gold Cup looked every bit as good as any Major League Baseball or NFL football game and was a heck of a lot more exciting. Putting the Yamaha Gold Cup event aside for the moment, let's look at a more realistic motorsport facility effort. I mean, with enough money, anything can look great. And clearly, Yamaha had enough money. Most of us don't, and have to have a more modest approach. The Yamaha Gold Cup did encourage me that motorsport had possibilities, real possibilities, business possibilities, not this goofy stuff we'd all become encountering for years. If motorsport were a real competitor in the sports entertainment marketplace, the tracks would be paying the racers to show up. I know. It's hard to imagine. We've been racing for our own money for so long, we can't even imagine it any other way. In Europe, back in the 60s and 70s, things were a little bit better, as it was commonplace for racers to be paid start money. That means the promoter would offer a racer, say, $1,000 to show up. That wasn't the purse money. That was still up for grabs. Start money ensured that you were going to be there so the promoter could advertise your presence. You would still be racing for whatever the purse was, but you'd get $1,000 or whatever you negotiated. It could be $100,000 just to show up. I'm sure many people watching this will think, well, that's how it works. After all, the promoters need the racers to put on a show for which they sell tickets. Without the racers, people don't buy tickets. Nobody buys a ticket to sit in an empty stadium and watch nothing. So it makes perfect sense that the people racing should be getting paid. It's not the way it works. The reality is, when a racer gets to the pit gate to enter a race, he has to pay a sign-up fee. Then he has to buy a pit pass for each of the people he's bringing into the pits to help him. It can be very expensive just to get your car or bike or whatever into the pit area to prepare to race. The point I'm making is, racers don't get paid. They are racing for whatever the purse might be. Very seldom do racers ever win more than it costs them just to sign up, let alone cover their expenses. The money just isn't there. In the early days, most racers were mad at the promoters for taking advantage of them. The fact is, that isn't true either. If the promoters were getting rich, we would have more of them. And the fact is, in the last 30 years, we lost every Chicago area motorsport facility. Every one of them. In a capitalist system, if the tracks were making money, we'd get more of them. Yet, the opposite has happened. Again, one has to wonder why I didn't just find something else to do, as so many had. And I'll answer that, but not now. For right now, I just want to lay out a little history and reality. Before I'm done, you'll see the money is there. You've just been looking in the wrong place. I'm not teasing. The money is there. We just don't know where to look. And frankly, if we don't figure it out, motorsport will completely disappear. Okay, in order to understand, as I suggested a few seconds ago, let me get to something less grand than the Yamaha Gold Cup. And let's start from the beginning. To open a racetrack, first one has to purchase land suitable for building a racetrack. This doesn't mean property of appropriate size, it means property in which the local government will allow a racetrack to be built. This can be a real challenge, and there is nothing new about this problem. I remember talking to one of the owners of Bob Joe Sycamore Speedway in Sycamore, Illinois. They sort of solved this problem. It was at least 40 years ago. I don't remember if it was Bob or Joe or both that I talked to. They had a small farm across the street from the track. The track had been there for many years. I actually started my motorcycle racing career there because they held amateur flat track motorcycle races every week in the late 60s. At that time, a racer had to earn a certain number of amateur points in order to get a pro license, and I earned my amateur points at Sycamore Speedway. Anyway, while chatting, I asked if they were worried about the town because the town had grown significantly over the years and people complaining was inevitable. I remember seeing a smile in the eyes of the elderly man I was talking to. Nope. Years ago, we bought all the property around the track so we wouldn't have to worry about it. It seems that they loved racing and wanted to ensure its future. I thought they were real heroes, along with others like Kevin Dawson at Lake Geneva Raceway, previously discussed on Motorsports Unlimited. In fact, many, if not most, motorsport facilities exist because of the dedication and sacrifice of the track owners. They certainly are not the villains that have impoverished the motorsport community. They are, in fact, in most cases, heroes. Okay, I'm getting off the track, but I wanted to make sure in our effort to learn how to compete, we properly identify with whom we are competing. It's important. All right, let's imagine you have acquired an appropriate property and necessary permits. It's time to start hammering and nailing, sort of. First, you have to design the facility for the kind or kinds of motorsport you have in mind. Then it's off to an architect to prepare proper blueprints and drawings that construction companies can make sense of. After that, the machinery starts moving dirt and your dream facility starts to become a reality. Of course, you are only at the beginning of making decisions. You have to decide how many seats to buy and what the quality should be. You have to make decisions about vendor space and, don't forget, restroom facilities. We haven't even started. How about lighting? Are you planning on running events at night? Motorsport facilities are big, and the lighting it takes to properly illuminate them can cost millions. I think you get the idea. Creating a motorsport facility is a huge undertaking requiring more than imagination and dedication. It takes money. And you have to remember, as you're making decisions, there are other competitors in the marketplace you are endeavoring to enter. When people come to your facility, you want them to come back again. That means buying tickets. You have to make sure they have a good experience. So, when you're deciding on seats, you really like the idea of upholstered seats. They're expensive, but something people will remember. On the other hand, if they're going to be exposed to the weather, not really practical. After a number of sleepless nights thinking about it, you eventually decide on aluminum seats with backrests and arms. Not the best, not the worst, but presentable and practical. And who knows, if enough revenue is generated, perhaps luxury suites are an eventual possibility, if you leave space for them in your plans. This stuff isn't easy, and all the investment in time, energy, and resources is dependent on eyeballs. It's as simple as that. Of course, people buying tickets is obvious. This is how one profits from all the effort, but the gate, that's people buying tickets, is only part of the way revenue is generated. There is also the possibility of a television contract, and while that may seem different from ticket sales, it isn't. It's exactly the same thing, and the value of selling television rights is totally based on eyeballs. In the case of television, it's ratings. The same goes for signage. When a sponsor decides he would like to buy sign space to promote his restaurant or auto parts store or tavern, he's buying eyeballs. What he pays for is advertising impressions. That's what the advertising industry calls them, advertising impressions. The number of people who actually see their sign will determine what it's worth. I'm mentioning all this because the same thing will apply to the imaginary track owner we are discussing. In order to get people to come to his facility, he has to make sure what he has to offer is competitive with those with whom he competes, including advertising. Think of a motorsport facility as a theater in a theater district. You and others have a theater to fill and must come up with ways of doing it if your theater is to survive. The seats, the lighting, and a million other things I haven't mentioned all are part of making your theater more attractive to the ticket-buying public. Of course, the paint and polish, so to speak, is important, as well as clean, comfortable restrooms. But the show is just as important. The most extravagant theater will be empty if the show isn't any good. As a theater owner, you compete to get the latest movie, or if it's legitimate theater, to get the best production with a quality production company. The point is, regardless of the venue in which you choose to compete, you have to come out with guns blazing, so to speak. There is much more than what I've alluded to, but I think you get the idea. Whether you're trying to fill a theater or a roller rink, everything is important. I remember a conversation I once had with a very good and successful restaurateur. I asked him what was most important, thinking it must be the food. To which he responded, everything is important. We work on a razor-thin profit margin and can't afford to fall down in any area. The quality of the food is important. The preparation of the food is important. The cleanliness of the room is important. And if it's too cold or too hot in the room, or if the music is too loud or too quiet, everything is important. Or people will go somewhere else. It really doesn't make any difference in what you choose to compete. Everything is important. When I was earning my amateur points at Bob Joe's Sycamore Speedway, I was paying attention when occasionally one of the Santa Fe Speedway pros would show up. They were fast and knew what they were doing. I decided to go to Santa Fe Speedway on Wednesday nights. Sycamore Speedway raced on Friday nights to see what the pros were doing. I couldn't race there yet. I didn't have a pro license. But I could keep my eyes open, and I did. In fact, I decided to buy a Bultaco motorcycle based on the fact that Bultacos were so successful at Santa Fe Speedway. That didn't guarantee success. I still had to ride the bike, but it meant I couldn't use the bike as an excuse if I didn't do well. Of course, for me, racing was about building my own equipment, but when one starts, it's a good idea to duplicate what the best guys have before you start reinventing the wheel. Building my own stuff would come soon enough, but first I needed to match what the best were doing. The point is, research is also part of competing. Finding out what the other guys were doing before going off with your own ideas is a prudent approach. So, back to our imaginary racetrack builder. He's going to spend a lot of time going to other racetracks to see what they are doing. It's all part of competing. Now, if I've accurately outlined what is involved in creating and operating a motorsport facility, at least some of the basics, what has gone wrong? I mean, something had to go wrong or we wouldn't have lost all of the motorsport facilities in the Chicago area during the last 30 years. What happened? We failed to identify and deal with an important element in competition. Yes, we did everything we could to provide first-class facilities. Yes, we did everything we could to provide a first-class show. So, what's missing? We failed to ensure we were competing on a level playing field. We failed to make sure those we compete with for public attention don't have an unfair advantage. Is there a lack of people and families with money in their hands looking to buy tickets? Absolutely not. One only has to go to a Major League Baseball game or try to get tickets for an NFL football game or, well, you get the idea. There are plenty of competitors in the sports entertainment marketplace surviving and prospering. What's wrong with us? Actually, that's the first question we always ask ourselves. It's the wrong question. Yes, it's a commendable question. Asking it suggests we look at ourselves to understand our failure. Commendable indeed. And always the first place one should look, but not the final place. And we're at the doorstep of the final question we have to ask. I spent some time earlier talking about competing in motorsports and the fact that competing required at least two parts. The first being to do your best to enter the arena as prepared as humanly possible, to build the best engine within the rules, while taking advantage of any possible ideas you might have to do it better. The same can be said for the vehicle itself. There are so many things to consider. If you're racing boats, in all likelihood the hull design is critical, as is the drive system, while you're all the time looking for, within the rules, competitive advantage. One can only speculate about who was the first to think locating the propellers halfway out of the water would produce a speed and efficiency advantage. It seems counterintuitive, but there's no rule against it, and these are the areas in which we work. Similarly, one can only guess who first thought a late model dirt car could get around a dirt track faster by manipulating the rear axle. It goes on and on. In drag racing, who would have thought to use the torque reaction of the rear banjo unit to lift the front of the car to aid acceleration? Trying to find these packets of wasted energy and putting them to work within the rules is what we do, and we do it well. I've said over and over, the motorsport community is the hardest working, most technically creative, underappreciated group in our population. But they labor on, driven by cerebral wiring that compels them to keep going. Keep looking. The next ground effects is just around the next all-nighter. There is very little to criticize in the motorsport community when it comes to creativity, enthusiasm, and willingness to work. So, if we're so good, why are we dying? The reason is there is a second part to competing. Making sure your competitors operate within the rules. We have failed to ensure we are competing on a level playing field. I find it interesting that we seem to understand when we are competing in a race, be it a car, boat, motorcycle, snowmobile, truck, airplane, you name it, that it is important to make sure the other guy is operating within the rules. We seem to understand how foolish it would be if, after all of the work, money, and time spent preparing your race vehicle, to allow those with whom we compete to have a dramatic illegal advantage over which we cannot succeed. We seem to get that part. and no one is above pointing out someone who might have an oversized illegal engine. Yet, we stand mute while other competitors in the sports entertainment marketplace, also are competitors, although not quite as obvious as the guy on the starting line next to us, are granted unassailable advantage. We inexplicably stand mute. I suppose, having spent most of my life in motorsports, I think I understand a little of it. We're machinery people. Our interest and talent is physics, not marketing or politics. I suppose it's a little difficult for those of us more accustomed to fighting for the last ounce of volumetric efficiency to raise our voice and demand a fair share of our right to compete fairly with other competitors in the sports entertainment marketplace for public attention. I mean, I don't think most of us would even know what that would look like. We easily understand when a competitor's engine measure is too large. We are being cheated out of a fair opportunity to win, to succeed. It certainly isn't something any of us would tolerate. I find it odd that we aren't similarly outraged when those we compete with for public attention in the sports entertainment marketplace are granted free time on television every day, many times a day, to make the public aware of what is going on with their activities, while motorsport is omitted. This isn't something I have to prove. One only has to be barely conscious to be aware that television has programs they call news every morning, every noon, every evening, every late night, and all these so-called news programs feature a sports segment, which is nothing more than free promotion for some of the competitors in the sports entertainment marketplace, at the expense of the others, I might add, and make no mistake about it, it always comes at the expense of the other competitors. I know it's difficult to tell from the presentations, but this isn't news. It's promotion of private businesses. Using Chicago as an example, we have the Chicago Cubs, the Chicago Bears, the Chicago White Sox, the Chicago Bulls, and so on and so forth, and we hear about them on television every day, many times a day. These are sports businesses that happen to use Chicago as part of their name, but they are in no way the property of the city of Chicago or the people of Chicago. They are private businesses in business to make a profit. They are no different than Walmart or Joe's Auto Parts for that matter. Treating their activities as news is preposterous. The fact that one of their employees has a sore elbow or a pulled groin muscle or a stinger is no more newsworthy than a cashier at Walgreens has a migraine. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time dispelling the notion of television news not really being news. It isn't. But this doesn't have to be proven, not in the United States of America. I suppose from what I've been told, it would be acceptable as news in Russia, but this isn't Russia. It's the United States of America, complete with a constitution that includes some rights, including free speech and free press for everyone. When a privileged few are the only ones allowed by law to distribute the news, it's hardly news. It's pitching, as in pitching a product or pitching a way of life or pitching their idea of normalcy. It's not news when a nation of 250 million people are denied by law participation. Less than 0.5% of the population of the United States are allowed to use the public airwaves. Calling what the privileged few do with their exclusive use of the public airwaves news is fraudulent. You know, at this time, I don't want to go too deep into this, but I promise I'll go back to it later. This particular episode of Motorsports Unlimited is about 501c3, and I don't want to allow myself to be distracted.
Yes, 501c3. In all likelihood, earlier in this show, you already admitted you don't know what it is, and I've said in no uncertain terms, it's important, and you'll see why as we go along. It ought to be easy to explain. After all, we're talking about tax law. Law. We all have to obey it. It ought to be perfectly clear. Well, 501c3 is anything but clear. I can tell you what it's supposed to be and its history, but I assure you it bears no relationship to the scam it has become. I can think of no better example of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Let's start with what it's supposed to be. The idea is there are things we need to exist that don't generate revenue. I'll give you an example. Libraries. I don't think anyone would argue the value of libraries. They represent the collective knowledge of mankind. This was true of the Alexandrian Library more than 2,000 years ago and is true of your corner library today. They make a nearly immeasurable contribution to our culture, and yet
They don't make any money. So how do they survive? We live in a capitalist society. The rules are simple. Those things that don't generate enough revenue to fund themselves and flourish die. Yet, libraries are still here. Interesting, huh? Don't misunderstand. I'm not suggesting libraries shouldn't be here because they don't pay for themselves. Quite the opposite. I think libraries are among the most important entities any culture can have. Let me try another example. How about schools? Schools that are open to anyone, free of charge. The public school system. They don't make any money. How do they survive? I think, given a chance to think about it, most would agree we all benefit from an educated society. I mean, it ensures that we can all read the street signs, understand and agree to contracts, intelligently participate in the democratic process. Our system of self-government couldn't exist without a literate population. Yes, we need schools, but how do they buy books, pay the gas bill, the electric bill? Everything costs money, and if you don't generate revenue, how do you survive? Okay, one more, and then I'll get on with it. How about cancer research? I think everyone on this planet would like to see an end to this dreaded curse, but how? Those involved with scientific research to find a path toward ending this plague on mankind may spend generations figuring it out. Scientific research that costs money, yet researching a disease may not bear fruit for generations. Hardly something those interested in making money would find an attractive investment. So we have something we all agree should exist. Yet the capitalist system has no room for these things, which benefit all of us. Maybe not this quarter or next quarter or even this generation, but important nonetheless. So how do we do it? Enough with the examples. There is more, of course, but if a few of you are still watching, I'll move it along. What I've outlined is the basis for 501c3. Not the entire basis, but a substantial part. I didn't even mention religion, even though it is the most often noted 501c3 entity. Its inclusion isn't necessarily about something we needed which has no other way of being funded. In my view, religions are included because of the constitutional guarantee of freedom of religion and the fact that the power to tax is the power to destroy. Thus, our Constitution almost dictates religious organizations not be under the thumb of government as they would be if they were taxed. Anyway, I think you can see 501c3 touches every one of our lives. It is very important, yet defies explanation. I can tell you from my experience, when it comes to explaining 501c3, nobody knows. When I started poking into this some 30 years ago, it was out of desperation to fund Motorsports Unlimited. I figured there had to be a way. I certainly couldn't afford it myself and had come very close to losing my house trying. Working in public access television, one encounters a number of 501c3 organizations, mostly religious, but others too. It didn't take much inquiring to learn the boundaries of 501c3 and that they were vague at best. I talked to a number of lawyers and was taken aback a number of times when I was informed the only difference between a profit-making corporate organization and a nonprofit is a nonprofit doesn't pay taxes. It didn't make any sense. Why would any corporation not just declare they are a nonprofit and not pay taxes? I spent a fair amount of time at the library trying to understand nonprofit organizations. I certainly wasn't doing this kind of work for profit, and I wasn't interested in building an empire. I was interested in saving a community of which I am a part so I can get on with my real work and the contribution of which I am capable. I wanted to call the public's attention to what television was doing to our society in general and my community, the motorsport community, specifically. I wanted to educate the public about the Radio Act of 1927, the Communications Act of 1934, and the unintended at that time consequences of those pieces of legislation. It seemed to me there had to be a way to fund this effort, and from what I could gather, that's what 501c3 was created to accomplish. I had to figure out how to do it. It turns out there are a number of nonprofit organization categories, but the one that everyone wants is 501c3, and the reason is the tax advantages. First, the organization doesn't pay taxes, and to a church taking in collections every week, that might be very important. But for us, it didn't mean anything. We don't make any money, so it's sort of a big whoop. But there is a second advantage. Someone or some entity donating money to your cause can deduct it from their taxes. This is very important and offers an opportunity to attract funding. There are lots of 501c3 organizations dedicated to raising public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation. Art appreciation, music appreciation, it goes on and on. I remember back in the 50s and 60s, many of the groups fighting for civil rights were 501c3 organizations, and that's how they funded their efforts. It seemed to me fighting to save the community of which I am a part fell into the same category. We too were being harmed by the unintended consequences of old legislation, and people ought to know about it. But who will tell them? It seemed to me that's exactly what one of the things 501c3 was created to accommodate: education. While looking for this information, it became abundantly clear the process of acquiring 501c3 status was muddy indeed. Apparently, it wasn't always that way, but over time, the scoundrels had pretty much perverted the system, and regulation on top of regulation had been added to discourage the scoundrels. I found the paperwork daunting, and frankly, this sort of thing isn't what I'm good at. I decided to hire a lawyer to make the application. On more than one occasion on Motorsports Unlimited, I've said everyone needs to develop 3 professional relationships in their lives. Professional relationships with a doctor, a lawyer, and a mechanic. They are all going to charge you a lot of money for something you know nothing about. You need to find a doctor, lawyer, and mechanic who knows what they are doing and you can trust. I mentioned their skill level first because if they don't know what they are doing, it doesn't make any difference how hard they try. They won't be of value to you and may hurt you. I mentioned trust in the same breath because it doesn't make any difference how good they are at what they do if you can't trust them to use their skills to serve you. They won't be of any value to you and may hurt you. It sounds easy, but it isn't. How about an example? Let's take what appears at first blush to be the easiest, an auto mechanic. Remember, there are at least 2 things to be considered: skill level and trust. How in the world does the average person know if their mechanic has the skill level necessary to work on an automobile? The modern automobile is an incredibly complex mechanical device that in recent decades has become even more complex with the addition of computers and other electronics. Most people have trouble figuring out where to add oil, or what the oil does for that matter, let alone think about the hydraulic complexities of automatic transmissions. So how does one select a competent mechanic when they know so little about the mechanism for which they seek help? Then, after one figures out a way to determine how skilled a mechanic might be, there's the issue of trust. Because the mechanic is skilled at what he does is no indication he or she can be trusted. These are 2 different things. Ever since I was a teenager, back in the 50s, and I was told about short sticking at a gas station where I had a part-time job, I realized how important trust would be. I guess I was young and naive, but I was shocked when I was told about making extra money by short sticking a customer. You know, I guess I better take a moment to explain short sticking, as it has been decades since a person at a local gas station actually put gas in your car and checked the oil and tires, but it used to be commonplace. The guy putting gas in your car was also the shop mechanic, and while gas was going in the tank, he would check your oil and the air pressure in your tires. It was not uncommon for the mechanic to go under the hood and pull out the dipstick to check the oil level, then walk back to the driver's side window to show you the dipstick, and the oil was a quart low. Of course, most people would just say, well, put a quart in. Unfortunately, it wasn't unheard of for the mechanic to not push the dipstick all the way down. So when he pulled it out, the stick was showing you were a quart down. Usually, they would have an empty oil can with a spout already in it. They put the empty oil can on the engine oil filler neck while they finished up fueling the vehicle and checking the tires. The process was called short sticking. And the profit for the mechanic was you paid for a quart of oil you didn't get. Trust is a separate issue from skill level. Larceny has nothing to do with capability. It has to do with character. A skilled mechanic bent on larceny is as bad as a mechanic who lacks skill. As I said, everyone needs to develop a professional relationship with a doctor, a lawyer, and a mechanic, as they are going to charge you a lot of money for something you know nothing about. All of them are in a position to take advantage of you if they lack character. It is important that they know what they are doing and you can trust them. Most mechanics would never short stick a customer, and our human interactions with each other has to be based on faith. There is no other way. None of us is in a position to become a skilled mechanic or a doctor or a lawyer in order to select someone for those services. It isn't practical or even possible. But as you go through life, you encounter capable, competent people and develop a professional relationship with them. Don't let them go. These people are probably going to be important in your life. With all of this in mind, I was faced with selecting a lawyer to make our 501c3 application. I was lost. I didn't know any lawyers, nor did I cross paths with them in the field in which I labored. I remembered my older sister had some legal work done a couple of years before, and she seemed to speak quite highly of the lawyer she used. I called her, and yes, she thought he was good, and she trusted him. I got the number, called him, and made an appointment. In his office, I asked him if he was familiar with 501c3 work, and he said he was and had done applications before. My question was, how much? He said $500. I told him I had to get the money together and would get back to him. A couple of months later, I went to his office, gave him the $500, and asked him how long he thought it would take. I was eager to get started on our work. It seems ridiculous now, some 30 years later, but at the time, I thought there was a good chance just showing the wrongdoers the people they were hurting might be enough to solve the problem. Wrongdoers meaning network television and their various so-called sports news reporters. I mean, why just assume these people were evil, ill-intended scoundrels without first calling the damage they were doing to their attention? It seemed to me if the people responsible for omitting motorsports from television sports news were aware of the pain they were causing and they were of good character, they would at least consider the consequences of their actions. At least it was worth a shot, and this public access television platform might just be able to reach them. I felt I had a sense of urgency concerning doing something about this motorsport problem. I wasn't getting any younger, and if getting this 501c3 status was the key, I wanted it as soon as possible so I could fix the problem and get back to work. Unfortunately, the weeks passed without progress. I didn't really want to bug the guy, but the $500 I gave him was all I could beg, borrow, or steal, so to speak. I suppose today, 30 years later, $500 doesn't sound like very much, but in today's dollars, it was well over $1,000. My already dismal financial situation, meaning paying for everything myself, was threatening the existence of Motorsports Unlimited. After a number of calls to the lawyer's office that went without response, I started showing up at his office to sort of move him along a little bit. In the meantime, I was looking into finding out how this 501c3 stuff worked. Oh, I understood the theory, but how did it work in practice? It turns out there are thousands, make that hundreds of thousands, of fund-granting foundations. One only has to go to his local library to find volumes devoted to these organizations. They are actually broken down into categories. Those foundations interested in medical research, those interested in educational, those interested in feeding the poor, and so on and so forth. I was astonished at how many fund-granting foundations exist. I was equally astonished at how many 501c3 organizations competing for those funds existed. While it was encouraging to see how many fund-granting foundations existed, it was equally discouraging to see how few seemed to be interested in what I had in mind. Oh well. There is nothing wrong with being the first to raise a concern. I also found it discouraging to see that it has become something of an industry for the privileged. What I mean is every foundation into which I looked had its first requirement to be considered for funding was the possession of a 501c3 letter from the government. It raised a question in my mind about how successful I might be at acquiring a 501c3 letter if part of my work was challenging the way the government was functioning. For example, my oft-repeated questioning of how the public airwaves were being managed by the government via the FCC. I wondered how favorably my application would be viewed when they realized part of my purpose was to help the public understand their right, indeed, their ownership of the public airwaves, and my insistence they should be asking, who gets to use the public airwaves and for what purpose? I didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but I was getting suspicious. By now, I was making weekly visits to the lawyer's office without results. He was either in court or not there. I am aware I'm not a patient person, so I tried to contain my anger. It didn't seem like a good idea to go off on the lawyer I was depending on to successfully apply for 501c3 status. On the other hand, I was becoming disillusioned with the possibilities of 501c3. I was bothered by the notion that the first requirement for applying for funding was showing a 501c3 letter. It seemed to me this put the government in charge of giving in our country. Keep in mind, no one is denied the possibility of speaking out on any issue, you know, free speech and all. What they can deny you is the possibility of funding your efforts. It looked like a catch-22 to me. Yeah, you can speak out, but you don't have the money to be heard. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Well, as always, I should say, I've run out of time. But I want to remind you, you are watching Motorsports Unlimited Explanation 9. And earlier in this episode, I mentioned the money it takes for motorsport to survive is there. You just don't know where to look for it. I promise, in Explanation 10, I'll show you where the money is and how to dig for it. Right now, I have to squeeze in some motorsport action footage, or John Platania is going to desert me. John is the man who helps me produce these episodes and, as I've explained before, has had enough with this talking stuff. See if we can get this right.
No.
Hold, Allison, step right on over here. You have a question.
I was just going to say we have another one involved. Where's he? The 27.
No, he doesn't. This gets really involved. Now, did I back it up enough here? Let's see if. Yes, I did. Okay, this is going to be that initial boot again, right?
Right about in the middle of the turn, I touched him. As I tried to get on the inside, and I had the line, but Smitty ran in the back of me and upset my car.
Upset your car. Now again, it looks like you're back in the driver's seat. 58 car back out in front.
Right, I didn't feel him hammer on me going into 3, so I figured, he was just out of the picture, and I don't usually watch in my rearview mirror.
You're not all that interested in giving him that much room, are you?
No, we try to race tight here. We really do, everybody.
Okay, Dave, it looks like you're coming back again.
I'm closing back in again. There's the same move underneath, but just not enough to get around him.
It looks to me like you're banging.
No, we're clean. We're real clean there.
You agree, Dave? He's not touching you? I'm sorry.
There's no touch in there.
Okay, because it really was awfully tight. Once again, Dave, what are you trying to do?
Well, I'm still looking for that inside move again. Trying to get a nose in on the inside to get him out, coming out of the corners.
The whole thing is keeping us close in this race is he's getting in the corner better than I am, but I'm coming off the corner better than he is. That's why neither one of us are really walking away with the show.
Okay, it looks like you really got him there, Dave.
Right.
And now what happened?
Well, I just ran out of racing room. It looked like I come out of 4 and started to get the line on him. Obviously, we just ran out of room.
There it is, folks. You've been watching Motorsports Unlimited Explanation 9. I would like to thank John Platania for his help, and I'd like to thank you for watching. I'm Bill Wildt, and I'll see you next time on Explanation number 10. If you like this stuff as much as John does, I'll bet you can hardly wait.
This program made possible in part by support from ABC Auto Parts, located on Ashland Avenue at 138th Street in Blue Island, Illinois.
Motorsports Unlimited is produced by Bill Wildt, president of the Motorsport Advancement Crusade.
This program made possible in part by support from Jimmy's Red Hots, located on Grant Avenue and Pulaski Road in Chicago.
Motorsports Unlimited was created to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. You can contact us by email at msutv.com or email us directly at msutv@aol.com. We enjoy hearing from our audience and encourage you to let us know what you think. Now, this is not one of our usual next weeks promoting next week's program. This is a reminder that Motorsports Unlimited is now global on YouTube. Simply subscribe to Bill Wildt Motorsports Unlimited on YouTube and watch us anytime.
So that's it, another edition of Motorsports Unlimited and the lovely ladies of motorsports. And be with us next week because we'll have something real exciting. Bill Wildt's going to have the lovely ladies, and just about anything can happen right here on Motorsports Unlimited. Every week at this time, we bring you the best in motorsports. So be seeing ya. Bye-bye. And keep on rocking.